Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm dialing in here on the banks of the Swan River from Whadjuk Noongar land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and just invite each of you to think about and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that you're dialing into this presentation from as well. Now, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this Charity Law Association presentation. We have a visitor here in Perth, Professor Masayuki Tamaruya, who you can see on the separate screen as well. Now, Masa and I are going to be talking to you a little bit about public philanthropic intermediaries, and it all relates to some work that we are doing, an Asia-Pacific comparison between Australia, Japan, Singapore and South Korea. And we're sort of partway through the work, but there's still a little bit more to do. So please, if you have any comments or questions, they'd be most welcome. Now, a little bit of a bit of background about Masa before we start. So Professor Tamaruya is based at the University of Tokyo, and he's a comparative legal scholar, and he's somewhat recently gotten into the non-profit space. But prior to that, has done a lot of work in comparative trust law and also more broadly comparative law between common law and civil law systems, and has had experience in the US and the UK as well as in Japan. So he's very well placed to talk to us about the Japanese context and also sort of put that into how things might fit for those dialing in from Australia and New Zealand, you know, bringing with it all the common law and charity law conceptions that we have to the context as well. So Masa, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It is a great pleasure. And thank you for the generous introduction.
Thank you. So what we're proposing is we'll run through some slides, and which I will share with you. In a moment, apologies. Apologies, just opening the slides. Whilst the slides are being a little bit slow to open, what I might do is just, in terms of general format, we're proposing to talk to you for about 25, 30 minutes, and then really just open things up for questions afterwards. And we're quite happy as well. If you have questions, do let us know. We'll try and keep an eye on the chat or reactions as we go along, but do feel free to let us know questions as we go along as well. Okay, so okay, can I check that you can see the slides? And apologies, they're not in slideshow format, but only because the computer won't let me share them that way. So can I just check that you can see? Are they coming up for you, Masa? Excellent. All right. So sorry for the slow start to proceedings. All right. What we should sort of start off with really is what we actually mean by a public philanthropic intermediary. That's what we're sort of focused on for this research, and we'll talk about why we're sort of looking at them in a moment. But just to sort of cover the terminology, what we're really thinking here is that we're looking at structures, institutions that support donor choice, for instance, of the ultimate recipient of charitable funds that have been given, and also to support plans to give over time in more strategic ways. So really sort of structures to support ongoing donor choice about ultimate recipients. They're public in the sense that these are not private foundations. You can see we've got here a big crowd of people actually at a famous intersection in Tokyo. So it's really sort of gathering funds, donations from a big group of people, not just a small family or single individual. They're intermediaries in the sense that the organisations that receive those funds don't themselves primarily carry out activities to pursue public purposes, but instead hand the money on to other organisations. So you can see we've got a range of, soup kitchen, cultural organisations, educational organisations, onto a range of organisations that themselves more directly carry out public purpose activities. And philanthropic in the sense that these are vehicles whose objective really is to receive gifts and put them to a public purpose. So they're not receiving gifts using the money for their own devices, their own sakes, but putting them to a public purpose. So why are we suggesting, or why do we think it's worth looking at these public philanthropic intermediaries and doing so across a few different jurisdictions? Well, across a range of jurisdictions, so particularly across more developed economies and from I guess a range of democratic or largely democratic political settings, there's been some sort of common themes in terms of changing factors, expectations. So changes in social expectations about adoption of more business-like practices in the non-profit sector, increasing expectations about keeping track of how money is spent, greater expectations of accountability that apply not just to the non-profit sector, but to government as well. Alongside improved data and data tools, so some overseas examples of Candid or Tencent Charity, or in Australia, we have a charity register, for instance, so some more tools to actually track what's going on, and greater institutional forms that actually support that more involved, structured approach to giving as well. So we'll talk about what some of those forms are as well, but they're starting to develop in a range of these jurisdictions, in part to meet those changed expectations. We're sort of interested in looking at this in a Asia-Pacific way, because in the US, these public philanthropic intermediaries have massively increased in scale in relatively recent times. So they've been around for quite some time, the last 100 years, but it's really over the last decade or so that there's just been a huge increase. So some of the stats from the US are that there's a 400% increase in use of these public philanthropic intermediaries over the last 10 years. In the US, they hold about $230 billion of assets, which is about 1/4 of what private foundations hold. But giving from public philanthropic intermediaries in the US, where they're called donor advised funds, is sitting at about half of the giving from private foundations. So they're really important vehicles for giving money out to building charities as well. And in the US context anyway, giving directly to public philanthropic intermediaries accounts for about 20% of non-intermediary giving. So that's actually pretty high when you think about those sort of statistics. So there's been an explosion in the US in terms of the use of these public philanthropic intermediaries. And we're just sort of curious if we have similar sorts of social pressures that exist in places like Australia, Japan, Singapore, South Korea. Those are the other two jurisdictions we're looking at in this research. What are the institutional settings in those places to support use of public philanthropic intermediaries? And are we likely to face some of the concerns that have arisen in contexts like the US, where they're a bit more advanced than we are further down the track of actually using these institutions? So we'll work through in this presentation a number of those key concerns. It's not to say that necessarily those concerns will be to the same level or even exist in these jurisdictions. We're just curious most of the research has been done looking at the US, and we're wanting to look outside the US and think, well, do we have the same sorts of problems? Are there other opportunities to make use of these structures? Master, I might hand over to you to talk about the final point on that slide.
Yeah, shall we move on?
I think given the sound, we have to go up here, sorry.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you very much for having me. It is a very great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ivan, for organizing everything. And it is a true pleasure both to be here and work on this project. Ian has been a great leader. We are still halfway through. We have more work to be done, but we will, both Ian and I will benefit a lot from whatever feedback you might have through Zoom today. So I was very excited. So I'm picking up on the last point. I guess what we are doing is to ask sort of overarching question of what philanthropic intermediaries are doing to sort of achieve greater intergenerational equity. And I think there are two stages to that. And I want to use Japanese example to illustrate. So Japan is aging, and there is significant wealth gap. And so 63% of all the household assets are held by people of age 60 and above. And there is also wealth disparity within those elderly generations. These people are eventually passing on their wealth to the posterity, either through inheritance or through charities for the good of the society. And I guess there are two stages. Non-profits through intermediaries have potential to work for this intergenerational equity. That's one thing. And supposing that the non-profits and intermediaries are facilitated in that process, the second challenge is it really doing proper consideration to achieve this intergenerational equity as a goal? Japan is really facing the first question. I will talk about it in the next slide. Japan was not really a hospital environment for non-profits. So their work has been very limited in this sort of sphere compared to corporate sectors and government sectors. The second level, whether there is proper consideration of intermediate equity, there is probably more severely questions in the US. So there are dual questions under this umbrella question of intergenerational equity. So probably you know American context better I do, obviously, and well. This next slide, okay, I have to see. In the next slide, I'm giving some background to the Japanese development. The starting point is that the Japan is not a hospitable environment for non-profit. That has been pointed out by a number of comparative scholars. So the US, UK, along with Australia, it's said to be a liberal regime that is from Solomon and Ahaya's social origin theory that have been quoted broadly. There, the public spending in social welfare is rather small, so government plays lesser role as compared to non-profits. On the other hand, the civil society, in comparison to sort of for-profit employment, civil society is relatively large, and so in liberal regime, we tend to see greater number of non-profits with diverse sort of approaches, and there's independent contribution to society. The polar opposite is social democratic. So like Sweden, Norway, Finland, there's a substantial government spending. That means that the non-profits have relatively smaller role to play. particularly in social welfare works, they are more keen to, there are more non-profits in expressive sort of phase of non-profits. Now, Japan is a bit of an anomaly. Government spending traditionally have been smaller in social welfare. But at the same time, the government have placed certain restrictions on the works of non-profits. And that's sort of termed as statist. And so the legislation has been restrictive, and the tax concession is limited to non-profits. And that was that sort of originated from 19th century, late 19th century sort of modernization of a legal system. Although there was a growing philanthropic move in 1920s and 30s, all these wells were destroyed, and very few foundations survived the destruction of war. Very few of those did survive, but on the basis of contracts with the government and subsidy from the government, and they were doing social services on that basis. And so the Japanese nonprofits, first of all, was very small, and the secondly, it's more sort of service oriented. After World War II, there economic recovery, but that didn't really help because the corporate sector played a very big role in the welfare of the population, together with lifetime employment. The revenue were kept within the corporation to sort of compensate generously to the employers rather than distributing to the shareholders who are potential philanthropic engines. So these were sort of the infrastructure that was sort of supporting statist model. Things changed after 1990s with the collapse of Japanese stock market and equity property market. Corporate welfare cannot be sustained because the corporation is not making as much money as they can, and state spending is increasing, but with the rising debts of the state budget, that is not sustainable. So these are making life in Japan difficult, but it is sort of opening up the space for nonprofits to play a greater role in the society. Okay, so that's the context.
Masa? So what we thought we'd do, we've sort of described or set out the context of it, is just talk about what are the institutional responses to a desire for public philanthropic intermediaries or support for that more structured and strategic giving in Australia and then in Japan. And in Australia, there are a variety of responses. You can see on this slide, we've sort of set out public benevolent institutions, for instance, particularly for some overseas development giving are being used. There are also specific listings. So the Australian Sports Foundation is clearly a major way whereby individuals can give money with a request that it be handed on to a particular local sporting club. But by and large, the main institutional form that's used in Australia is the public ancillary fund. So we're focused on public ancillary funds, although being mindful of other forms as well. If we think about, well, what is a public ancillary fund? It has to be a purpose trust, which would typically mean a charitable trust in legal form, although there do seem to be some statutory trusts that have been accepted as public ancillary funds as well. They can be provided in a variety of different ways or by a variety of different organisations. So by community foundations like the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation or Australian Communities Foundation, but also by more financially focused organisations like trustee services companies or financial services companies, and some examples are put on the slide there. And we do have an independent national sub-fund provider, so Australian Philanthropic Services Foundation, and also called them, because this is the terminology used in the US, single issue foundations. So usually those are set up by doing organizations, universities and others that then set up their own, within that university, their own foundation to basically receive funds, which are usually then put towards the purposes of that organization itself, rather than sort of spread more broadly than that when they're distributed. In terms of, well, what's the size of public ancillary funds, and within those, if we're thinking public philanthropic intermediaries, because usually the way public philanthropic intermediaries are set up in Australia is by way of a sub-fund, so a management account within public ancillary fund. The donor then puts some money into that sub-fund and has some ability each year to then say, well, I'd like $100 from this sub-fund to be given to this particular charity, this particular organisation. So they make their recommendation or give their advice each year about where they'd like that money in the sub-fund to go. So the sub-fund is, that's the terminology used in Australia, but effectively a management account within the public ancillary fund. So what do we know about size? Well, we know we've got about 1,400 public ancillary funds holding about 4.8 billion, according to the latest tax statistics from the ATO. But sub-funds are a subset of that. So not all public ancillary funds are set up to permit donors that ongoing support and ongoing choice about where the money is given. Christian Siebert did some research when he was at Swinburne in 2019, estimating about 2,000 sub-funds holding about $1 billion. We used a methodology that Susan Phillips and co-authors used to estimate what you'd expect if giving rates and also, so giving as a percentage of income and also participation rates were sort of similar to US levels. And the expectation based on that would be that we'd see about 4.5 billion in Australia in sub-funds. So clearly there's a big difference between 1 billion and 4.5 billion. We're looking at about 4-5 times smaller than what we'd expect if we had sort of similar activity to the US. So it's not absolute orders of magnitude difference, but there is a bit of a difference there. Master, I'll hand over to you to talk about Japan.
Okay, there are institutional responses in Japan, but in comparison to the US and Australia, it's more recent and limited in scope. More traditional ones, trust banks, charitable trusts, that began in 1977. They've been around for some time, but they have been operating rather heavy regulation. Charitable trusts receive tax concessions, but the regulation is imposed where the funds, the donation can be made only by money, and the funds that are created can be invested, but only to the same safe government bonds and corporate bonds, and not corporate shares. Distribution committee must be created. That is to ensure proper payout to good works, but that has cost consequences. And there are also regulation over fees. Trust companies, trust banks are not allowed to charge on the basis of assets under management. The regulation says they can charge no more than personnel fees and other costs necessary for the trust administration. Things are changing. The change has not been implemented. It is now ongoing legislative process to remove trust banks' monopoly and allowing diverse kinds of assets to be managed under a charitable trust. So we have to see the space, but that is limited scope of charitable trust. There have been community foundations. Again, that is rather new. The first community foundations were created in 1995. That's Osaka Community Foundation. That was established with the initiative of Osaka Chamber of Commerce. It has 3.4 billion assets with 280 funds, but that means that the funds, each fund are relatively small, although they have received 4.5 billion yen worth of donation in total. In terms of donor advice fund, where the donors have continuous advising privileges, there are only 14, and it's not very easy to create enduring funds. Usually, the income generated by investment is rather limited, so they have to eat into the capital. The reason being is that the management of funds are rather conservative. It is done only to bank deposit and government funds. Now, the second community foundation was established only in 2009. We have at least 21 of those, but they are rather small in size. So the total assets managed by 21 community foundation is just 1.4 billion yen, less than half of what Osaka Community Foundation is doing. Their scope is rather narrow. That's usually single prefecture or cities. And in fact, they are rather driven by NPOs rather than philanthropists. It is rather a sort of vehicle created by NPO people to receive funds. But at the same time, they have to supplement income by government contracts and other revenue generating activities. So these are conventional intermediaries, but we are beginning to see more philanthropic centered initiative. I give two examples, but they are only the two. Public Resource Foundation created in 2013. They have 14 funds, 4.1 billion yen, and expended to 2.9 billion yen within the past 10 years. So it is quickly surpassing the scale of what Osaka Community Foundation has been doing. I've met with the CEO of the foundation. It is sort of somewhere between Japanese community foundation model and sort of financial service model of community foundation. She started from the industry, but she has difficulty sort of in her career. So she focused on nonprofits, and she focused on how the nonprofits can generate sufficient income. She was willing to work with local property developers, and so unlike conventional nonprofits, she was willing to receive more diverse assets in the form of real property. And also, she's doing, while she's sort of received these funds, she's also providing NPO consulting and grant impact assessment. More recent example, Japan Philanthropic Foundation, that was created in 2020, so it's very new, and it's more closer to financial service provider model. The CEO, I was able to meet him, but he started out from Nomura Securities, so he is from financial services background, and he's working with financial institutions to create funds and also receiving referral of high net worth individual. And that has, we haven't seen how it have grown very well, but he's now taking a similar approach to American donor advice fund. But that's where we are in Japan. And in terms of the scale and potential, similar to what Ian was talking about with Philip's approach, it's using only 1/12 of the potential, at least in comparison with US figures. So we are still sort of in the early stages of intermediary works.
But we thought we should just a couple of quick similarities and differences between Australia and Japan, and then I'm just conscious of time, then we'll talk a little bit, we'll just be brief about some of the concerns so we do have some time for questions. But sort of interesting, both Australia and Japan, it's still, as Masa said, early days in the sense of the potential for these public philanthropic intermediaries. In both places, the extent of use seems much lower than what's projected based on US giving and participation rates. Both places have a large reliance on trusts and also on community foundations. Some of use of those structures might have started a bit earlier in Australia than in Japan, but it's still early days for both. It's probably still fairly new for professional trustee companies or financial services companies in both places to be actively pursuing clients offering public philanthropic intermediaries, although Australia might be a few years ahead, but Japan's obviously starting to make moves in that direction as well. So there is this question about, well, is there room there for major growth in both places? Is this something we need to worry about, sort of concerns that have been raised in the US if the use of these sort of intermediary structures really explodes in a similar way here? There are some differences, obviously, between Australia and Japan. We won't touch on all of them, but one thing you would have picked up from Masa's description is the level of conservatism in the regulation of trust banks and trusts is probably a bit higher than in Australia. So some of the restrictions on fee charging exist to a greater extent than occur here. So that might have some ramifications for concerns about managers keeping assets under management high in order to earn large fees rather than actually pursuing the purposes. I think given timing, those are probably sort of the key similarities, one of the differences. We'll just touch briefly on some of the concerns that have been raised in the US and just reflect on some initial thoughts on whether they might apply here. So one of the really major concerns from the US perspective is this worry about delay. So people get a tax concession, a tax deduction from giving money to the philanthropic intermediary, but it might not be for many years, or some people worry never, that something's actually done with that money to pursue a public purpose, some sort of activity that more directly furthers that purpose. So in Australia, for instance, public ancillary funds, we said that's the main institutional response. They are subject to minimum payout requirements. So you can see the 4% of market value of the fund's net assets must be distributed each year. There are some exceptions to that, but as a general rule, 4% must be distributed each year. That's not something that exists in the US. So that is something we already have in the Australian institutional settings that provides some sort of assurance that benefit is being provided more actively, more immediately to when the money is actually given into the philanthropic intermediary in the first place. That said, public ancillary fund assets are increasing each year at a rate well above inflation. So clearly that 4% is not leading to a spending down or a cap at real value of assets. It is just imposing a brake on increases. Masa, do you want to talk about Japan?
Yeah. So Japanese position would be that the concerns about delay is sort of coming up from the far away horizon. The Japanese sort of emphasis, both from regulatory sides and also the from non-profits on the ground, has been to spend very quickly as soon as there is funds. So public interest corporations, the regulation meant that revenue and expenditure need to be balanced. Charitable trusts, because of those limitations, actually the asset under management have declined by 1/4 within the past quarter of a century. And that means that there are spending from charitable trusts, whereas there's no sort of matching scale of donation because of the economic difficulties. Non-profits are more service-oriented, but more recently they have begun to sort of
look into enduring funds and long-term management and investment of the funds that are retained. And there is ongoing reform, gradually relaxing financial regulation on nonprofits and expanding tax concession even for those funds that have greater diversity in terms of assets and management style. So things are changing. Delay concerns about delay might be coming up at some certain point in the future. Thanks.
Now, conscious of time, we did have two other concerns we're going to talk about. I might just touch on them briefly, just so you know what the concerns are, and then we might pause there, I think, and just see if people have questions. And obviously, we can go into a bit more detail on these concerns if you'd like us to. But two of the other big concerns from the US are about using public intermediaries as ways of supporting political activity and therefore generating political power as well. That's in part due to lack of disclosure about who donors at the individual donor level are to the public philanthropic intermediaries. Probably the short summary of what's on this slide is that neither Australia nor Japan require specification of donors, lists of donors, transparency around that, even though lists of recipients in some cases might be required. And the other key concern from the US is we call it mission drift or streaming of private benefits to the organisations that house or affiliated with the managers of the actual donor advised fund or public philanthropic intermediary itself. So to the extent you've got a financial services organisation that sets up the charitable trust that operates the donor advised fund or the public philanthropic intermediary, there have been concerns that it is making profits, for instance, on investment or other fees based on assets under management, and therefore there's an incentive to just warehouse assets and earn those fees rather than actually pursue public purposes. There have been some intimations of that in Australia in the past, but I guess the extent of the evidence is pretty slim, so it's still a bit of an open question as to the extent that's happening. I think we should pause there for questions. I'm just conscious that we only have 20 minutes left. Do people have questions they'd like to ask, whether it's sort of more generally about Japanese treatment of non-profit sector and public philanthropic intermediaries, or the concerns that we have here? I'll stop sharing just so we can see. There we go. So feel free just to either raise your hand or just speak out, and we should be able to see you. Natalie. Natalie, I'm not sure. Are you still there? You may have raised your hand earlier. Apologies if so. Patrick. That's,
Can you hear me?
yes, we can. Thank you.
Just wondering to what degree you both think that the growth in these public intermediary funds is driven by the superannuation industry, so for example, in Australia, and superannuation policy generally, and how does that differ between the countries you've been looking at? So Australia, America, and Japan, in terms of a possible driver for some of the growth in the philanthropic funds.
That's a really good question. Do you want to say, do you want to try, see if you talk there, so let's see if we can hear you on the normal speaker.
Okay, I'm trying to answer, but can you hear?
Yeah. Yep.
Thumbs up.
Okay, great. So trust banks are interested, but because of the fee structure that is mandated by the financial regulation, they are not very keen at the moment, that there's not enough financial incentive. Having said that, things are becoming sort of relaxed. with the regulators becoming more open to having greater the regulators seeing greater potential for this intermediary work. So it's rather fluid. As we speak, there is legislative proposal going through the parliament, and we have to see how the law changes, how the regulatory guidance will be changed. So things are changing, but probably I should say that there's not a big financial incentive at the moment, but that can change depending on how regulations are reformulated.
Thank you, Masa. And I mean, it's a really good question in the Australian context, because the Productivity Commission obviously is looking in its philanthropy inquiry at how to double philanthropy by 2030, which you'd think might tie into, well, they do look at use of philanthropic intermediaries in that draft report they've released, but superannuation, so the transfer of money from super funds into charitable entities, including public philanthropic intermediaries, is obviously a live question, and one that the Productivity Commission said in the draft report anyway, we don't need to change the rules to encourage giving money from super funds to the charity sector. I don't know if Natalie is around. I know she's done some work on this. I don't know, Natalie, do you want to comment? I mean, that's a pretty general answer to your question, sorry, Patrick, but Natalie, do you have anything more specific that you might want to say about, if you're there, about the problems that exist at the moment? Because I understand there are some difficulties with getting money out of the super fund into, philanthropic intermediaries or other charitable recipients.
She said she doesn't seem to be able to unmute.
Oh, Natalie can't unmute. Okay, sorry, Natalie. Well, that's all right. We might I'll click on ask to unmute, but otherwise we can always put Natalie in contact with you after, Patrick, because I just flagged Natalie because I know she's done some work in this space. Right, and Fiona Martin said, yes, you can chat. There you go. So Natalie, if you have anything, you can pop in the chat, just a link or any articles or research publications you have for Patrick to have a look at. That would be great. David, I see you've put your camera on. Is that because you had a question that you wanted to ask? Oh, no. Are there any other questions that people have?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Sorry.
Right. So sorry. These are some biased perspectives from New Zealand. Disclosure of interest. I am a trustee of a small DAF that's got a Christian focus, but within the New Zealand context, there are about 12 regionally focused community foundations, and to the best of my estimation, only 4 operating nationally, one through a financial services provider, one by a group that's solely dedicated to providing a DAF, one that's financial, has got a medical focus, and one Christian. The thing I was going to say is that there's quite the 4% constraint in Australia would not be a problem for most of the US DAFs that I've seen, and certainly not in New Zealand. In terms of resources coming in, you see about 60% go out within the next, the concurrent financial year plus the next 6 to 12 months. So delay is not normally the problem. The heightened aspect is actually collaboration amongst donors. Donors find being donors quite lonely, and they actually like doing things in teams, as it were. So I don't know whether that helps or hinders the conversation, but it's my perspective, albeit slightly biased. Sure.
That's very helpful. Thank you, David. And I guess one question I have for you around that percentage of distributions is that I know in the US context, it was and sort of still is to some extent possible to give from a DAF to a private foundation. Certainly, it's still very easy to give to another DAF provider. So the percentage distributions there are somewhat contentious in the US context because not all of that money is actually going to a doing charity. Some of it still goes back to intermediaries, whereas Australia's 4% is matched. I mean, the community foundation changes may affect this a bit, but is matched with a prohibition on giving to another intermediary. So you're a little bit more sure that the money's gone out to a doing charity. In the New Zealand context, is there worry that any of that distribution is circular in the sense of going to other intermediaries rather than going out to charities that are more actively carrying out public benefit activities?
I don't discern that as being a concern, but maybe I'm biased. I don't think money is circulating back to intermediaries. I think it's and then just by way of explanation, the 60% number is what I've seen reasonably consistently from DAFs in with a Christian focus in the US, UK, and some other places, and probably also an Australian DAF like that operates out of Melbourne.
Yeah, thank you. And look, I think it's a good question in the sense that one point Master and I were talking about before is, are we focused too much on all the negatives and not enough on the positives? Because there is obviously a key role for these public philanthropic intermediaries to play to respond to societal desire to have more engagement with giving, to enable family involvement in giving. So we do, as part of the research project, we need to sort of focus on also the positives that come along with it and whether the institutional settings support or hinder achieving those positive outcomes as well. So I think that's a timely reminder for us. Thank you, David. Are there other questions that people have?
There are two questions in the
Oh, sorry, in the chat.
Q&A box, yeah. Chat box, yeah.
Okay, I'm just bringing the chat up.
So there are two questions at the bottom, Natalie Sefa and Fiona Martin.
Okay. Yeah, so Natalie's asked a question. I had a question about intergenerational equity and how you're proposing to address this issue through philanthropic intermediaries. So that's, as probably many people on the call know, I'm particularly interested in intergenerational justice and intergenerational equity. So I'll find a means to address that through almost any institutional setting that we talk about. So I apologize for that. But I guess and Masa raised this point. It's really interesting because in many places, Japan and Australia, we have aging populations to some extent. In an Australian context, and I think in New Zealand context also, the baby boomer generation holds significant wealth. There's going to be a handing over of that wealth over the next decade or so. And so I guess we're thinking here about public philanthropic intermediaries as one of, not the only recipient of that wealth. And what are the institutional settings in place to cope with that large influx of wealth? Are they going to encourage that wealth when it's handed over to be actively used, at least in part? Can it be entirely accumulated and warehoused for 100 years in the future? So that's probably what's sort of really focusing our minds a bit on the intergenerational equity, is just thinking about a large wealth transfer coming up over a relatively short period of time, and how the institutional settings are going to deal with what happens to that lump of wealth. So that probably doesn't entirely answer the question, but that's sort of what we're trying to grapple with. And there are different ways you could achieve that, whether increase the minimum distribution rate, that's one mechanism. Another mechanism might be really sort of ensure that the fiduciary duties that apply to the directors or trustees of the charitable trust or the charitable trust company include thinking about those issues and actually meaningfully doing so which might then feed through to policies that the DAF providers have as a means of addressing intergenerational equity. So there's sort of a few different ways of responding to it, but I guess our concern is just making sure that's thought about, and one of those sort of mechanisms is included somehow in institutional settings that we have.
Yeah, if I can add, yes, this is a very broad question. I have lots in common with what Ian has to say. But to look at it sort of a broad perspective, we can think of achieving intergenerational equity in aging society. Older people leave assets to the posterities in different ways through taxation and also direct inheritance. And I think one of the things that can be done better is to sort of use non-profits and civil society by way of donations and philanthropic mechanism. And philanthropic intermediaries can play a significant role. That's the position I'm taking. If that happens, then the next question is whether intergenerational equity can be properly considered, and particularly the challenge would be the mission drift or private benefit. If the funds goes to the charities, but it's not going to the proper destination, or if there's no proper sort of weighing of justice between spending at the right moment, or sort of growing the assets and to serve for the future generation. That's something that non-profits can make autonomous decisions, but whether that is made properly, that's a very difficult question. I think, well, I was inspired by Ian's writings about charity load and accumulation, but that's something that we have to look into. There are not very many law or regulation about it. We are looking into different sort of possibilities, and the area is very fluid. So we are still working on this in this area, but I think it's important area to make inquiries there.
Now we've got two more questions. I think Fiona has asked a question about, are there ongoing issues with funds held by financial institutions not going out to ultimate charitable purposes, and giving an instance of native title monies held for native title groups. I had done a little bit of empirical work in this area where some Indigenous communities had indicated concerns with the financial service institution who was acting as trustee of those charitable trusts and the way that fees were being charged. So I think that is a live issue that's that does need looking into. I might not say more on that, because the final question, I think, given we have Masa with us, and we're very lucky to do so, would be a really good one to pass on to him, and that is, would you be able to speak to charitable giving in Japan generally, including attitudes to giving and rates of giving? So a bit of a broader picture of what's going on in Japan.
Yeah, so this is great question, and great meaning difficult to answer. There's not very good statistical data. There are different reasons. Again, giving is not a huge part of Japanese ordinary life, so there's not sufficient data being collected. At the same time, Japanese community have done through very, very informal ways of contribute to the society, and that doesn't go through formal charitable routes. Having said that, we are beginning to see more formalized volunteer and philanthropic sort of motions, things that put into motions. So when I was at school, it was just doing community service and giving money to a community chest. And if there is a disaster, there is a sort of round of buckets going around. That was about it. But we are beginning to see my son and my students at university more committed to contribute both in terms of money and efforts and energy in a more formalized way. And that is sort of
bringing the figure of charitable giving high up, probably more than sort of what is actually being quoted in the data. So I cannot say, I cannot give statistics, but the tendency, I'd say, is that the charitable giving is going up in a more sort of structured and sustainable way. So that is my reaction to this. This is a great question, and probably we need to work more on this area, both in terms of empirical studies and sort of institutional studies. Yeah, thank you very much. This is a great question.
Thank you. Now, I'm conscious of time. Are there any final questions that people had?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Do you think that lack of data hampers giving in Japan? Is there a perceived lack of transparency?
That's a very good question. Lack of transparency. The legal system has not really emphasized on transparency. And so there's not much of an outcry about the lack of transparency. There have been lots of corruptions with service-related charities. So there are always criticism. I'm not sure if that ties into the small scale of charitable giving. But again, we don't have sufficient data. So what I can say is there is the debate about what we can do about eliminating corruptions. And there is also a rise in charitable giving. The relationship is a rather complex and unexplored area. That's, I think, the safest way I can sort of answer. I hope this is sort of the best clarifying reaction that I can make. I hope that's good enough.
Thank you.
Well, given, and I apologize for the technical difficulties at the start. I think that's why we're now right up at 12 or 12 noon here, 3 o'clock and 5 p.m. for those in New Zealand. So the New Zealanders are really holding on right to the end of the day. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Masa very much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much. We are still working on, so we really appreciate all the feedbacks. So thank you.
And I hope this is all right with Masa, but if you are interested and would like to get in touch with Masa, just let me know and I can help just coordinate exchanging emails and things like that. So no doubt a number of you are probably quite interested in what's going on in Japan. Just reach out to me. I think you should have my email through the Charity Law Association, and then I can put you in touch with Masa. But thank you, everyone, and we will continue the conversation. Watch out for something coming out in due course on this. Thank you.
Thank you.